Good day, class. This lecture is on ecosystems as complex system. It brings us to a higher level of discussion from our study of populations in the past lesson. Let us begin by looking at the objectives. At the end of this module, you are expected to, number one, appreciate the characteristics of a complex adaptive system. Number two, discuss the unique characteristics of ecological complex system. Number three, explain the significance of models of ecological complex systems. Number four, interpret relationships between various measures of complexity as displayed by geographical representations of data. And number five, draft structural models of ecological complex systems in your immediate environment. We begin with the definitions. First, on the term ecosystem. An ecosystem is a physical system. It is a unit of study that is composed of a set of biotic and abiotic elements that are interacting with each other and are interdependent. Ecosystem is a complex adaptive system. The rest of our discussion is going to center on the elaboration of this complex adaptive system. Next term is ecological complexity. This refers to the complex interplay of all living systems and their environment and emergent properties. I trust you remember the meaning of emergent properties. Now note, the concept of ecological complexity emphasizes on the relationships between pattern and process in natural systems. We have discussed what patterns are, and we have also dwelt on process in our former discussion. Now we go to the term sociological complex. This complex has four important characteristics. Local interactions between individual ecosystem components occur in a sociological complex. There are feedbacks existing between processes occurring at different scales. What do you mean by this? Process, for example, that occurs in the ground layer of vegetation and the canopy layer of vegetation. These are two different scales, and the processes that take place in them are feeding back on each other. There is amplification of minor variations in initial conditions. This means that initial conditions that appear to be just simple ones are amplified in a sociological complex. For example, a small talk that begins in a barangay could become viral. Transmission is an amplification of the small talk that began at the barangay level. Next, the fourth important characteristic is that there is emergence of patterns in the absence of global controllers. Now we go to part one of my discussion, which is an introduction to complex adaptive systems. Let us look at what is a complex system. I present here an overview. Let us begin with the four primary parameters that make up a complex system. Number one, the complex system is made up of elements of different hierarchical levels within the system. I have talked about ground level vegetation, canopy level. These belong to two different hierarchical levels. But of course, you have levels in between them, like the shrub and the understory vegetation. Number two, primary parameter is there is non-linearity in the complex system, where non-additive interactions and feedback loops over time can result in shifts or flips into whole new regimes within brief periods of time. A small change in input value may manifest or trigger large system effect or a butterfly effect, indicative of sensitivity to initial conditions. For example, we talk about a reduction in the amount of rainfall or drought. This drought in one province could lead to conflagration on a larger scale. A more realistic example would be what is happening now outside of our country. So we have drought occurring in the places of Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal, and this made these countries readily subject to conflagration or fire on a large scale. The next primary parameter is connectivity. These appear as networks in a higher level, which indicates the degree of how things flow in the network. Consider the Russian blockade of grain exports in the Black Sea. The connectivity here is that the effect on Ukraine is not just through reduction of their income by way of revenues coming from their exported grain, but this is also connected to the famine that is occurring in South Africa because of the absence of grain imports. Autonomy and adaptation. The complex system is able to self-organize. It is able to influence also the process of evolution that shapes complex systems on a macro scale, like ecosystems, economies, transportation networks, and neural networks. Let's have an example. The ecosystem of perpetual ice that is now subject to global warming. In the North Pole, we wonder what animals could possibly take over the white polar bears if this global warming occurs for a longer period of time. Let's take a look now at the examples of complex adaptive systems. One example is climate change. Climate change, as you know, has many manifestations. It manifests in the form of drought, floods, heat waves, etc. Next, emerging and re-emerging diseases or pandemics or inflation. These are also complex adaptive systems. We have had this COVID-19 pandemic of our country in the not long past, and this occurrence of this pandemic is also considered a complex adaptive system. Wars occurring between Russia and Ukraine is another example. Why do we call these complex adaptive systems? Well, you see, you cannot just consider any one of these are just simply social or economic systems separately. They have their own structures, functions, and development rules. So they are practically virtually dependent on each other. There is interdisciplinary nature in the study of the interactions of these different systems. Interactions within the system affected by climate change and among the different countries affected by climate change. The effect is on a global scale, in other words, and there is an obvious interconnection among the places that are affected by these. Now let's take a look at the ecosystems as complex systems that require our understanding of the different types of ecosystems that serve as sources of complexity. An ecosystem complex would have vegetation patterns as a source of its complexity, species distribution, population dynamics, weather and climate change, food web structure, soil formation, gene expression, and individual tree crowns. All of these elements are sources of complexity in a system like the tropical rainforest. Now, let's take a look at examples of each type of ecosystem. There are three types of ecosystem of interest: terrestrial, aquatic or water ecosystems, and the artificial ecosystems. The terrestrial ecosystems include deserts, savannas, steppe, temperate forests, tropical rainforests, boreal forests, tundra, and Mediterranean vegetation. Aquatic ecosystems include freshwater ecosystems like lakes, ponds, rivers, torrents, marshes, and swamps. Marine ecosystems, which are aquatic ecosystems, also include reef, ocean, continental plateaus, nutrient upstream flowing areas, and estuaries. And artificial ecosystems include urban industrial ecosystems, rural ecosystems, and agroecosystems, or what we call agro-industrial ecosystems. From the list, you will note that some ecosystems, like the tropical rainforest and estuaries, are highly complex, while artificial ecosystems, like the rural ecosystem, which is influenced more by man, are artificial ecosystems that are less complex. Note also that some ecosystems are more resilient than others. They are able to spring up when they are destroyed. How are ecosystems characterized quantitatively and qualitatively? So now we go to part 2 of our discussion, which is ecosystems as complex adaptive systems. We go into the defining, characterizing, and measuring complexity of ecosystems. Note that many emergent properties and characteristics of ecosystems are counterintuitive and unpredictable. Heterogeneity of components increase system complexity. Heterogeneity, meaning diversity and the number of components, increase system complexity. The degree of complexity of an ecosystem and its health and integrity very likely increase the system's resilience and robustness. How then should we study ecosystems? Complex systems can be characterized in terms of the sources of complexity present in the system. Now, there are several sources of complexity, and we're going to dwell on two of these. The first one is spatial complexity. This refers to the manner in which species are organized in a given geographic location. So here is a figure that shows the actual locations of 4 keystone species. These are plotted on a 2D coordinate graph. And the locations of the species were determined using a GPS device. You are shown different sizes of bubbles here to indicate the varying sizes of the 4 species where they are located. This is one way of representing spatial complexity. Still on the spatial complexity. Here is another graph which shows us the populations based on altitude. We have in here 3 kinds of populations, colored blue, red, and gray. The different levels at which these are found in the graph indicates the different altitudes where they are found. Here is another graph that shows a measure of species richness with respect to space. So we have here what is known as a heat map, where different colors of pixels correspond to the different ranges of a number of species. Another is temporal complexity. Temporal complexity is exhibited when the population cycles of predators and prey feed back into each other to create a stable ecosystem. What does this mean? Well, we can look at the life cycle of a predator like the alligator and its prey. An example would be the big fishes. We can take a look at the life cycle of the alligator vis-a-vis the life cycle of the big fishes. And we will note that these two life cycles are interconnected with each other in order to create a stable ecosystem. Continuing with the complexity overview, why are complex adaptive systems more appropriate to the study of ecosystems as compared to linear reductive methods? Our answer to that can include three, of which I have listed. Number one is complex systems don't have additive effects. Number two, complex systems have outcomes that are not proportionate to the input. And in a complex system, shifts may be sudden and unexpected. This is where the lecture ends, and we will have the second part of the lecture on Study Guide 7 next time.